Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So simple.
I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for January 2nd, 2023, and I'm JD Duran, and I have a wonderful guest joining me for this conversation. He is the Iron Claw champion himself. If you follow him on Twitter, there is no one greater that is carrying the torch right now for this movie than the great Jacob Throneberry. Jacob, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to be here. And the Iron Claw thing, it came out of just a pure love of the film. And
yeah,
then I went to bed and I woke up the next day and I was like, wow, 1 million people have seen this tweet. And then it just kept going. But
yeah,
no, but I'm very happy that this is the movie that I've become synonymous with, at least as of recently. This and now John Wick, which both great movies, but yeah, I'm glad to be an Iron Claw champion and supporter. It's a fantastic film.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It seemed as if everything that you were tweeting out about the film over the last few weeks went super viral.
I was getting like messages on Instagram of people like screenshotting it or like recording the tweet and then putting it on Instagram, and I was like, dang, this is a lot. It is funny though. It is one of the few, because I've had a couple tweets, especially recently, which is insane. But I've had a couple tweets where you get 1,000 likes, or you get 10,000 likes, and you get like you're starting to get all this buzz around tweets. And I know it's dumb talking about Twitter, whatever, like this, but that was one where I got like 130,000 likes and a whole bunch of retweets and quote tweets. And I was like, it was the one time where I was like, this is cool. I'm not muting it. So my phone was on blast for a long time.
Yeah, for sure.
I was like, I would have rather put my phone on do not disturb and just not like seen the notification yet, and then gone back through them and like, oh wow.
yeah, it was pretty remarkable to watch it unfold on my end, even just seeing people's reaction to it. And I mean,
I will say though, with fame comes heavyweight, because I'm now like constantly, I'm like, I have to keep it rolling. I've got to keep this. I had the 3 or 4 Iron Claw ones, and then I had a John Wick one, and I'm like, okay, what's next that I can just keep it going.
I know. Once you get a few good tweets in you feel the desire to keep the ball rolling.
I'm ready to take over the company. And
a lot of my stuff, I'm like you. I simply tweet out things that I feel in the moment. I feel strongly about a performance or a movie, and that's all that it is. I put my phone down. I either go to sleep or I'll go and play with my kids, and sometimes I'll come back and I go, okay, people are responding to this, and that's all that it is. It was a fleeting thought in the moment. Like I had one about Paul Giamatti and The Holdovers some weeks ago that did fairly well, and it was like a fleeting thought before going to sleep. That's all it was.
Yep.
I had seen the film a second time, just in love with that performance, wanted to throw out another comment, and then I wake up and I have all these notifications. It's like, okay.
Yeah, the funny part, like that. The funny part about the big one, the Zac Efron dancing one. The funny part is that it was a very unproblematic, like not a hot take tweet. So I didn't get a lot of hate for it, which was really great. The only thing I got hate for was I didn't mention Hairspray, which Hairspray is a great movie, don't get me wrong. And when I said The Greatest Showman was bad, that's when people were like, oh, what's he saying about it? But it was funny because you could tell the people who actually like knew musical theater, because I mentioned Hadestown, and nobody who was like, oh, I love The Greatest Showman knew what I was talking about with Hadestown. And the people who like knew musical theater were like, yeah, Greatest Showman is bad, he's correct.
Yeah.
And then everyone else was like, "What are you saying? The Greatest Showman's the greatest movie I've ever seen."
Oh
And
my
I was
gosh.
like,
Yeah.
"This is what you guys are going over."
I know that's one of those weird moments in culture where you really felt the disparity between cinephiles, critics, and the general audience,
Yep.
because the critic sphere or the cinephile sphere thought it was fine. I mean, sure, some went for it for sure. I would say the response overall was mostly tepid, but the general audience
Yeah.
loved that movie,
Loved it.
completely ate it up. And that is when you have to be careful when you're
Yeah.
talking to the masses for sure.
Didn't know there was such a fan base, but
Huge fan base for that film. I know, like even in my own household and with my family, I have to be careful because my brother, my sister, my parents, my wife, her family, like they all love that film. I'm the only one that's like, I don't know, it's not great, but
I'm not.
what do I
I'm
know?
like, you know what? There's a couple songs I like, but overall,
Yeah, no,
what are we
I'm with
doing?
you. I know, I'm with you. At any rate, we will talk more about Zac Efron, not in that film, but in The Iron Claw, which is written and directed by Sean Durkin. The film stars the aforementioned Zac Efron alongside Jeremy Allen White, Harris Dickinson, Maria Tierney, Holt McCallany, Lily James, and a few others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with The Iron Claw, it is the true story of the inseparable Von Erich brothers who made history in the intensely competitive world of professional wrestling in the early 1980s. Before we jump into the actual movie, I'm curious, are you a wrestling fan at all? Were you familiar with this story going in any way, shape, or form?
I was not. The town I grew up in, just north of Nashville, there's lots of wrestling there.
Okay.
Jeff Jarrett, who's I know is in the WWF Hall of Fame, he literally lived down the road from me. His daughters grew up. One of them was a grade below me. One of them was a couple grades. They played basketball with my sister. So I had I guess by association, been around wrestling,
Okay.
but it was never something that I really latched onto. My dad wasn't a big wrestling fan.
Yeah.
So for me going into this, it was as fresh as could be. And I don't know if we're going to talk spoilers or not, but I have it's funny my process going through it because it was not at all what I was expecting the movie to end up being.
Yeah. We'll hold off on spoilers for now. We will get to some at the end of the conversation because I do
All
want
right,
to talk
perfect.
about the ending of this film for sure. However, I am a lot like you. I did not grow up in the wrestling world. There were a few years around middle school where I would watch, I want to say WCW with my brother, I think is what it is, if I recall correctly. But that was a short fad for me. It did not last very long. And that's about all I had going on in terms of professional wrestling. So this was a story I was not familiar with at all either. I know Ric Flair, know that name.
Yeah.
And he pops up in this movie. The character, that is, not the person. And that's about all I was familiar with going into this. So it was very fresh for me as well to experience. So laying that context out on the table for the listeners, the viewers out there, Jacob, what did you think about The Iron Claw?
I mean, just for openers, I was not aware of Sean Durkin or any film that he's directed. I've not seen The Nest. I think that's probably his
Good movie. Yep.
most well-known work.
Mhm.
And I mean, the story is what the story is. It's one of the most tragic stories in easily in American history and probably in history as a whole, just in how everything continues to unfold. And that's what I was told going into it, that the story was very tragic. And I still had, my doubts of how actually sad and tragic it could be. But even after the film, my friend who I went with stood up and saw the, based on a true story tagline. And they looked at me and they were like, this was so insane. I was suspending my disbelief. I didn't think that it could be real. And to find
Sure.
out that it was real is even more like heartbreaking in a way. But what I really loved was the direction and the tenderness of the writing and the performances. I thought Sean Durkin made some very, very creative decisions. Some of which, going back to the tweet, some of which I talked about on Twitter, but I think there were some shots in there that I thought were some of the best shots of the year.
Yes.
I thought,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I thought, and it wasn't just specific shots, it was specific decisions as well. Not to get into spoilers, there's a stairway scene that, the first time I saw it, I was instantly given chills.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
and there's different scenes like that where he places these characters and these moments into this bigger picture in a way that that I found really, really engrossing. And then, not to mention just the writing as well from Sean Durkin. I was not aware of Sean Durkin as a writer or a director. And so seeing, his writing credits, which I know he has less of than directing, I'm pretty sure, but seeing his writing and seeing just how well he interweaved the story with the wrestling, with the brotherhood, it all, to me, I love the performances. We'll get into it. I think Zac Efron gives probably the best performance of the year. But I was really, really taken aback by Sean Durkin and his work on the film.
Yeah, Sean Durkin is a really great writer and director. You noted The Nest back in 2020, which was a really good film. I know there were a few here on the show, Ryan and Jay, when they were with us, they were huge champions of that movie. But Marcy May Marlene, I'd say I like even better than The Nest. That's one of my favorite films from 2011, was in my top 20 of that year. Really great debut there. I'd say made Elizabeth Olsen a name that people started to recognize and look at a lot differently. It's a really great movie. The Iron Claw, though, without question, is his most notable or most accessible, because The Nest and Marcy May Marlene were smaller films in their given years. This was given a much wider release, A24 backing this, I believe, and it's been his most accessible film to date, but it has all of those Durkin qualities that you tend to love in his movies. And I'm with you. This is a very good film. It's one of the most emotionally riveting movies I've seen in recent years. I cannot fathom what happened to this family and the emotional turmoil they would have experienced, but Durkin does his damnedest to give us an idea and to break our hearts along the way. His direction here is sublime. I agree with you. The editing and cinematography is mesmerizing. That overlay shot that you're talking about in this film of Kevin and David and Carrie's faces all overlapping, rendering this idea of how they're together as one, blurring the lines of their identities. It's a staggering moment that is incredibly effective. I also think of the motorcycle accident, the shot of Carrie waking up in his bed groggy and bruised, kind of subverting the idea of death that is continuously knocking throughout this film, only for it to reveal something that is still equally tragic as Carrie walks away from the counter. I'll say vaguely, my audience very much gasped when that edit occurs. Or perhaps most potently, and we'll talk about this in spoilers near the end of this conversation, that dock scene at the end. Yep. There is a reveal there. It's this emotionally incredible moment as it initially starts to unravel. But then there's this reveal that I just did not see coming, and honestly, it knocked me on the floor. Durkin's direction here and how he assembles everything we see is truly engrossing. And then there's Zac Efron, who I think should be considered for an Oscar. He's that good here. He's sensational in this film, and not just because of how he physically transforms, but he exhibits an emotional deftness that's as good as anything we've seen this year when it comes to Best Actor. There's, of course, the grief we see in the character, but it's not that one dimensional. It's also the envy he displays. It's the fear of the Von Erich curse. The naming of his son is one of the best scenes in the film, I think. It's, of course, the love he shows to his family and to Pam. He taps into that emotional complexity effortlessly, and it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. I don't know what his chances are of getting into the Oscar 5 for Best Actor, but that would be a surprise that I would be rooting for and championing alongside with you. He really is terrific here. Absolutely loved his performance. I do hope that people are considering it, Oscar voters, that is anyway. But either way, regardless of how any of that plays out, it's a spectacular performance alongside this entire ensemble, which is just terrific. And I loved all of the performers here. And I'm sure we'll talk more about them as we go. But yeah, between the cast and Durkin's writing and directing, it's one hell of an experience, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And just hearing you talk, going back to that duck scene, that's a scene where in a lesser movie, even if the movie leading up to that was damn near perfect, that's a scene that could ruin it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
different changes here and there in that specific scene could take that movie from, what people might say is, high 8, 9, maybe a 10 out of 10, and then just drop it. Just because of how thin that line is to cross with a scene like that. And I think that every decision that was made in that moment just knocked it right out of the park.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, Zac Efron is, I can't stop talking about Zac Efron's performance in this movie. I think there's such an emotional weight, not only for the character, for, seeing all these things, the idea of why are all these things happening to other people and not happening to me in this situation? Like, how did I get out of it? But also, like, you see him grow up, basically. You see, you find out he's never, had a girlfriend, been in love, done anything along those lines. And you see him kind of grow as a person throughout the whole thing. And I think, relaying it back to Efron's life, you've seen Efron, after High School Musical, get stuck in these typecasty roles. He did, he did Hairspray, which Hairspray, great to anyone on Twitter listening. I love Hairspray. But, he did Hairspray, and then he did Baywatch, and then he got stuck in the Awkward Moment and The Neighbors and all these like comedies, and then he started doing,
which he is funny in, to be fair. He is
great,
good in those
and
movies.
I love him. But it seemed like he was going from from typecast to typecast, and he got stuck in this rut of I have to be, for me to be an actor, I have to be the biggest and strongest person there, and that of course happened after Baywatch. And I know if you look up any of Efron's past, you can see how much it affected his life just getting into those roles. And so for something like this, where his sheer size as a person is used as an emotional vehicle rather than a comedic or an action sort of way, in a way, because there's very few people over the past 5 to 10 years where their bodies have been talked about as much as Zac Efron, whether it be his face after his jaw surgery that, people think he tried to get plastic surgery, and in reality, he almost died and had to have his jaw wired shut for months while it got fixed. And even in the interviews that they've had leading up for this movie, he was wearing sunglasses, and he would go out and interviewers would say, "Oh, I know you're a big shot, Zach, but what's with the glasses?" And he's like, "I have an eye infection. I just didn't want to, leave everybody out." So it's, you've got someone who at 18 years old was this huge heartthrob loved by everybody. And I think, you get to a point where now with this film, his size and his, his body and his expressions through his face and through, I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, through the 3,000 muscles he has on his body. The scene where he is, jumping off the ropes and then goes into his, slight workout montage when he's sleeping at the ring. It really all builds to that emotional performance that I think is truly, truly great, especially seeing, someone of that size and of that stature be this emotionally available,
Yeah.
especially with one of the last shots of the movie. I
Yeah.
think his performance is just it's so tender and it's so
Hmm.
honest and it feels so lived in that it just, I mean, it feels like this is one of the roles that Zac Efron was born to
Yeah.
play.
No, I completely agree. It's an incredible performance for all the reasons we've been talking about, the emotional complexities of the character. And you're talking about his physical stature in this film. I think what's so great about it, and yes, in the context of his career, it's interesting to even talk about Efron and the physical changes we've seen along the way, mostly for comedic effect, as we see in something like Baywatch, for example. And he very much is physically ready for this movie. He looks the part. He's massive, he's huge. He has this intimidating physical complex that if you were to get into the ring with Kevin, you know that you're dealing with someone who can, for the lack of a better term, just absolutely obliterate you at any moment. He physically looks the part. What's incredible about Sean Durkin's writing and direction and Efron and how he taps into this as well, that physicality is a facade. You
Mhm.
did a great job of articulating that Kevin, underneath this physical exterior, he's extremely vulnerable. He's perhaps a little shy. He's timid around women, as we see early on with those early scenes of him and Pam, played wonderfully by Lily James here. Again, demonstrating not just that timidness, but he overtly tells her, I've never had a girlfriend. I've never really been socially active. And part of that comes back to his commitment to the ring and why he's pushed toward these goals. And I do want to talk about that here in a moment as well. However, beyond that, there is something about, there is a vulnerability to the character that renders this physicality a facade. It's something that continues on as the film goes, and not just the grief and the I guess conventional emotion that the character would go on to experience given the carnage around him, and again cannot fathom what kind of emotional turmoil that would have been. However, beyond that, it's the fear of the curse and how that evolves, because in that early scene with Pam, he laughs it off. It's a joke. It's not something we take seriously. But slowly over the course of the film, you see the deconstruction of that and how that crystallizes there with the naming of his son, as I mentioned earlier. It's some of the envy that he experiences when he was the first to wake up in the morning for a workout, when his brothers would rather sleep in or eat breakfast or do something more lazily. He's the one that's out running. He's the one that carried the name before anyone else got in the ring. And yet there are opportunities that are given to his brothers first. And you see how he responds to that. And that's what this film is. Like, at the heart of this film, it does carry this facade, this machismo, if you will, in a way. But all of that is obviously a front for the emotional complexities that's in the character. And Efron taps into all of those equally, regardless of where on the emotional range it is. He does it impeccably. So it's incredible how he does have this physical presence, and in the wrestling scenes, you do see that come through a little bit. But mostly what we see with Kevin isn't him in the ring dominating other wrestlers. There are very few scenes of that, actually. It's
Mhm.
mostly early on. Most of what we see with Kevin is this emotional vulnerability. And the one moment of physical action we get with the character near the end of the film is devastating.
Yep.
It's absolutely devastating. And that's where the emotion and the physical part of him come together in this incredibly tender, heartbreaking way that Efron is just absolutely incredible at demonstrating here. Like it's a wonderful moment in this film. Efron he deserves a lot of credit. He's fantastic here.
Yeah, I think especially um, you talk about the physicality in the ring. There's the scene where he gets flipped and lands on his back, and
Yeah,
for
yes, there's that moment too. Yeah.
5-ish minutes, you're seeing him just fully in pain, do everything he can to get back up on the ring, and that's all he wants to do. He can't move, can't do anything, but he just tries his hardest. And then it's almost like getting back up on the ring is his biggest downfall,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like you said, he's the one who goes on the 5-6 a.m. runs. He's the one who is doing everything that he can, but it seems like this is all he has. For David just had a natural ability about him. He was able to speak, and that's
The
in wrestling,
personality. Yeah.
that's the biggest thing. What is it? Carrie was an Olympic athlete.
Mhm.
Mike had his music, and so it seemed like for him it was this or nothing, and I think it really really shows in just how much he wants it, but how much he wants it for the wrong reasons, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
He
No,
wants
no,
it to
yeah.
prove it to his dad, and he wants it to prove it
Yeah.
to himself rather than actually wanting to do it.
No, absolutely. I think you are getting to the heart of this film in another regard, and that is the Fritz character here, the father of these brothers that we see, and he's a very domineering father. At the heart of this film, it's about the brazen ruthlessness of Fritz and how his ambitions pushed his sons way beyond their breaking point. Even when the costs become vividly clear, he doesn't stop. He doesn't pull his punches. There's little compassion to be had, especially towards Kevin, despite being the most committed early on, as we're talking about. The Von Erichs don't get very far without Kevin's prowess in the ring, but that doesn't render automatic respect with Fritz. When David and Carrie are given opportunities to go further than Kevin, Fritz is almost giddy in a way. He doesn't really care who it is. He just wants the championship belt, and he's willing to get it at all cost, which is the tragic irony here, right? Because the price was almost Job-like in scale.
Mhm.
And I love Holt McCallany's performance here because he gives Holt just enough of a firm but affable personality that you can understand why his sons want his respect, but equally he's cold and emotionally vacant, which gives credence to his self-destructive apathy. I also love that the film doesn't do much to overanalyze Fritz's behavior. We see it, we see the effects it has on his sons, and Durkin lets the emotion of it linger. There's no scene here where Fritz talks about his past and explains his definition of masculinity. There's no moment between he and any of his sons to articulate any abuse he's experienced, and that's why he is the way that he is. No, none of that is here. It's all in the choices that we see with the character on screen. It's the things he says to his son, his complete lack of catharsis, and that has obviously some major ramifications dramatically that lead to some sequences in this film that are very hard to watch.
Yeah.
Very hard to watch. But I love that at the core of this film, how Durkin handles that idea of this domineering father, how he pushes his sons beyond his breaking point without spoon feeding the audience.
Yeah, and I agree. Actually, people talk about all the supporting performances. I think Harris Dickinson's great. I think Jeremy Allen White's great. I think both Maura Tierney and Lily James and Stanley Simons, they're all great. But to me, Holt McCallany gave the best supporting performance, and
Mhm.
and I really think it's because of how the father is. This is not one of those fathers that he's wrestling all the time. You have to be in the ring, you've got to be, but he also goes to his son's wedding and he's proud of his son, and he tells his new daughter-in-law she looks beautiful, and you get these subtle, like very subtle moments of him being a father, almost just enough to, like you said, you can see why they want his approval. He's
Yeah.
not this person who is out there and he says you shouldn't be married, you should be in the ring, et cetera, et cetera. You should be doing, like, he doesn't have this presence over his children that is so evil in a way that makes him a one-dimensional character. He really does have all of these different emotions to himself as well. And don't get me wrong, I think he's a very evil person. I think what he did to his sons far crosses the line of what should be done. But I think in the film, I think that there is a good balance of showing just enough to be like, does he actually care? And then pulling it back and be like, okay, no, he doesn't. But you can see why they think he cares, because,
Yeah.
it made me for a second think that he cared.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think he nails that balance impeccably. You do understand why his sons want his respect, why they want to get in the ring, why they want to follow his lead. And that then becomes something that Durkin deconstructs as the film goes. And we see that there's actually little empathy there to be had in the character. And maybe that's his definition of masculinity. Maybe it's indicative of the time, as this took place in the early 80s, I believe. But the film doesn't go out of its way to spoon feed us any backstory in that regard. We don't really know where he comes from, what his own upbringing is. And that leaves some interesting ambiguity. But what we do know is through the actions of the character, he does have a masculinity that he wants to hold true, that he holds his sons up to the same standard. And you see how that eventually pushes them to this breaking point. And when those breaking points do come, it's interesting how he continues this pursuit, how he continues these passions to this goal, regardless of where that takes them. And then you start to see the fallout, not just on Kevin, but his mom, Pam, as well, the brothers, how they respond to it all. It's incredible how Fritz is the nucleus of it all. And the balance of that and McCallany's performance and in the writing as well, to give Durkin credit. I think he gives us just enough without it being too much and without taking away from the brothers, especially Kevin. It's incredibly well handled in that regard. I agree.
Yeah, and I think like you said, the little that they give is from the very beginning in the black and white, which I actually enjoyed the use of the black and white in this.
And that's important for a couple
But it's
reasons.
from the little that we get in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. And really all we see there is him in the ring, right? We see the Iron Claw. Oh, this is my move. And then there's the sequence outside with his sons, which is important for reasons we'll get into, I guess, a little bit later. But that's it. That's all we get. It doesn't go into anything beyond this central family that the film is trying to focus on.
Yeah, and I think throughout the film, I think his performance is one, because a major idea of the film is the deconstruction of toxic and machismo, masculinity, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And kind of you see that when this sort of thing is taken too far, the ramifications that come from that.
Severe.
And
Yeah.
so I think with his character, you see somebody that is so ingrained in this way of thinking. And again, I'm with you. I'm glad that they didn't give us any backstory of, this is how he was raised and this is why he's like this. It just shows that, you have this man that the further and further he gets down this line, the more things that happen around him, he doesn't reach towards empathy or towards sympathy. He reaches to go further. And he thinks that the only way to get past these hard moments is to keep getting in. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, when I won't do any spoilers, when one of the characters passes, his first thought is, we have to win the belt. It is
Yeah.
not, let's take some time off to mourn. It is, your brother passed away. Who's going to take up and win the
Yeah.
belt?
Yeah.
And so I think it's for him, it almost seems like this way of pushing forward through more and more toxicity. And I think that is one of the greatest things about
Yeah.
his characters, because you can see that really played out. And like you said, it's not spoon fed to you, but he also doesn't sit there and try to hide that
Yeah.
that's what's happening.
Absolutely. And there's one detail I want to ask you about regarding Fritz in that regard. This is not a spoiler. It's actually not in the film, but it is a detail regarding Fritz in real life. So it is history if you want to go and look up this story further. But the one thing Sean Durkin does leave out, and I don't know if this was an artistic choice or a studio executive telling him, hey, let's not go down that road. I don't know which one it is. However, the one detail this film leaves out is that Fritz, with a German background, chose Von Erich very intentionally. That's not his given name, but he chooses that to enhance his Nazi heel personality in the ring. So that choice to change his name, to embrace this Nazi character. Now, as we've seen recently in the discourse, actors are not who they portray on screen, right? Like when you're an artist and you choose to embody a character that isn't who you are in real life. And wrestling is a lot of the same way, right? You're choosing a persona, a character to embody in the ring. So him choosing to be this Nazi heel does not mean that he agrees with or what's the word I'm looking for? He doesn't necessarily agree or hold those values at all. But we don't know because this film doesn't get into any of that explicitly. It removes it. But I bring it up to say, if the film did leave it in, would that have perhaps articulated further this machismo or this masculinity that defines Fritz to the point where it's hazardous and dangerous? Or is that a detail that would maybe render the character a little bit more one note? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think definitely, I think had it been put in, I think I would love to believe that Sean Durkin would find a way to interweave it well. But I do think that when you start getting into this kind of territory, and like you said, people play these characters, especially in wrestling and especially at the point that he was at, because at the point where he took over this moniker, he was, a very unknown, still trying to make his way. And that's the quickest way that he could do it.
Yeah.
And so, but I think when you start getting into that kind of realm, you start to lose any of the little emotional impact that I think he has. At least for me, I didn't know that story until after the fact. And I was like, oh, well, that makes sense because, for him, it was, let's get to where we need to get by all means necessary.
Yeah.
But I think overall, for the film, and it's similar with Sean Durkin talking about why he left out the other brother. I think
Chris, he's not even in the film at all.
I think, yeah, he actually, Durkin talked in an interview where he said that he didn't think that the film would get made if it had another tragedy in it. He said he thought that, it was one that the film couldn't really withstand. And so if that was added, he thought that the studio would probably say no. And so I think this is another instance where it's, the film is already so tragic and it's such an exploration of these brothers that I think if you start bringing in this idea of what Fritz was trying to accomplish before his sons. Maybe you get into a territory where it's, it starts to lessen any of the emotional scenes that Fritz has, and starts to, in my opinion, personally, vilify him more than even what the film was trying to do. And again, the film made him the villain. He is the antagonist of the film,
without
like
any of
point
that
blank period.
backstory. Yeah.
But I think you start to cross that threshold where he is now, an irredeemable villain. And while I don't think his character is that redeemable as is, I think with what they build, he does a pretty good job of kind of showcasing that, this is just his descent more and more into this toxicity to try to get to his ultimate goal.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting detail, and if Sean Durkin did include it, I would have been really curious to see what he did with it. I'm a little bit of I go back and forth on it, in the sense that I do think by taking it out, what we see with Fritz becomes more universal. I think the film is able to examine its ideas of toxic masculinity and over domineering father in a more broad sense that will make it more accessible to everybody. However, I just wonder if that detail was there, and knowing Sean Durkin, the way that he'd be able to perhaps, I think he would avoid controversy. I think he would want to maybe add another psychological perspective to Fritz, in the sense of, okay, why did he choose this? Was it out of necessity, to your point? Was it because he was still trying to make a name for himself? I don't really believe in these values, but I have to embrace this, so I can be this heel that is successful. That's an interesting juxtaposition, but maybe that's also a different movie, and that's an argument I can certainly buy into. But I feel like it's a detail that adds a layer to the character, but at the same time, I don't know if it's necessary for this film to be effective as it is. So I go back and forth on it. It's not really a criticism. It's mostly a detail that I just find intriguing, that I think still could have worked, but I understand why Durkin decided to leave it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I think for this film, I think, while it doesn't explicitly say why he chose the name, it's still just like, he still talks about he chose the name even though he knew that there was bad blood attached to it. And so I think they get this idea of that he's doing all of these things without on a whim, because he wants to progress. And I think, knowing that, there's bad blood attached to this name, and, there's this ultimate curse, et cetera, and him still not only taking on that name, but giving it to all of his sons. Because you see Kevin later on break that line with the naming of the son. And so I think it touches on the name, which I think is the more important part of that whole story than the character that he's playing.
And that's a great point. Honestly, that's a really great point. As much as I think the detail is fascinating, I do think the film does a great job. I do agree of still addressing it, but in an indirect way, because the name does become this curse. So the film's,
and it's synonymous with the family. Like that is what people know is the Von Erich family and brothers.
So maybe the film is suggesting that Fritz choosing this and maybe doing it in a way that, well, I don't want to say is controversial, but maybe it speaks to Fritz and the idea that he's willing to do whatever, even if it means embracing this controversial Nazi, character at all costs, because he wants to win. And if it's not going to be him, it's going to be his sons. But as a result of doing whatever it takes to win, despite the cost, along with that comes this curse that they have to try to break. So, and in an indirect way, the film does address that for sure. I do agree there. So even though it's not explicitly there with Fritz, you do make a good point in how the film addresses it in these interesting ways. Before we get to spoilers and we talk about the ending of this film, I want to also briefly talk about Doris, the mother of these brothers, played wonderfully by Maura Tierney here. And I love the slow emotional unraveling of the character because it's not an immediate catharsis with her. We see the first go, and there's of course a sadness there. We see her getting ready for the funeral, and it's a moment that Durkin emphasizes. But then there's a later on in the film, by the time we get to, I don't know what it is, the third funeral, there's this incredible scene, one of my favorite scenes of this film.
I know exactly where you're going.
It's this close-up of the character. She's almost trying to hold back in that emotion because that's how this family had established themselves, emotionally speaking, being very rugged, maybe Texan. I'm not from Texas, so I don't want to embellish there. But there is this familial ruggedness that these characters embody, including Doris herself. And she doesn't really show emotion until this scene where she's losing everything that she loves and holds dear to her heart. And that close-up, I think, is great because it's not just the look on her face and that slow catharsis that comes, but it's also Pam in the background telling her she has to put on the dress. And that reservation, I can't put this on, I can't do this again, without overtly spoon feeding that to the audience either, is striking. An incredible moment in this movie.
I think in that moment, I think there's a line. I'm not going to say this verbatim, but there's a line where she says, "Everyone will know it's the same dress."
Yeah, oh, gosh, yeah.
And
yeah,
I think
that's it. Yeah.
To me, it's this
devastating. Yeah.
It's this moment where, like you said, this family has, after the first funeral, Fritz tells his sons, "I better not see any tears."
Yes. Yeah.
And so, she has been sucked into this world and this life that, Fritz has created for her and for her sons. And to really kind of display this moment where even she can't take it anymore is really great. And I think there's a scene a little bit later on where Fritz comes in and he's getting back to his traditional masculinity. Where's the dinner? And she says, "I'm painting." And he's like, "Oh, you never cooked?" And she said, "I'm not hungry. You can cook yourself."
Yeah.
And I think it's just this kind of this quiet nature. You see her in scenes in the cathedral and in that scene in the bedroom with Lily James that you said, where you can feel her tensing up so much that she's ready to burst. And then when she finally does, in a way, it is very, you can feel it. Like you can feel that kind of release for her, where she's like, I have to be my own person now. I cannot be like a part of this
She's
anymore.
completely separated. Like her despondency has taken her to a different realm than Fritz at that point. Yeah, it's a striking detail in the writing, and I love how Tierney taps into that as well. It's absolutely fascinating. All right, let's talk about the ending of this film. So we're going to get into some spoilers here for the rest of this conversation. Fair warning in case you haven't seen the film. But we need to talk about that ending, Jacob, because it is absolutely heartbreaking.
So going into the film, I had seen the trailer, and in the trailer, I'm pretty sure there is that motorcycle shot of, Jeremy Allen White's character driving down the thing. I had thought that there was only going to be one death. And I was like, wow, this death had to have been like brutal and it had to have really affected him. And then to see the first death to the motorcycle accident to the next death to the final death, and all culminate in the scene that you're talking about. I love, again, I talked about it earlier. This scene could have destroyed the movie, could have made this movie something that had gone from a very great movie to a passable or even bad movie. Um, but I think the framing of it for me is the biggest thing. Kevin walking him into the house and setting him down on the table. And then that scene comes up where he's rowing down the river, and it's quiet. There's a small sound of the score, which by the way, we didn't talk about this in the non-spoilers. The score is incredible, and it deserves to be recognized. I've listened to it multiple times. I think the score of this movie is so fantastic, and the needle drops are so fantastic. But going back to it, I think this very tender moment of him on the boat, and then him getting up and him seeing the brothers, and then again another moment. I think if you have the oldest brother, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but if you have the oldest brother as an adult, I think that lessens the effect. But seeing him as a child and having that moment where he hugs him, and he even mentions, he's like, this is weird, like he understands like the perplexities of it. But I think the framing around that, which goes back to the decisions from the directing and from the writing, I think the framing around that, where you have put him on the table, and then you edit back to Kevin sitting on the table, you can kind of almost assume that this is Kevin's best thought for what is happening to his brothers. You can kind of assume that this is what he wants to happen. He wants Carrie to be going down the river and seeing all the brothers and hugging once again, because even though he can't be with them, he knows that they're all together.
Yeah.
And so I think that this scene was done about as perfect as it could have been. And it's one scene that I would say I would not change a single thing about it. And I know people have been arguing and talking about this scene in a negative light, which I completely don't understand.
Really? Okay.
I think this is probably one of the best scenes of the year. And when he sees his brother and he says, "You must be, my big brother," and he picks him up and they all hug and the sun's shining through him, I burst.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I exploded with emotions. And then I think for me, again, I think there's people who would take that scene and make it literal and make it a way of like, this is what happened after he died. He went back with his brothers. But I think with what Durkin does in framing it around Kevin, just like a lot of the movies framed through Kevin, but framing this around Kevin, having this kind of emotional like thought that is going through not only Zac Efron, but Kevin's mind of like, this is what I want my brothers to be experiencing. They experience like peacefulness. They're all together. They're not in this world that is, that is dictated by Fritz anymore. They are free as people and as brothers. I think that it was like I was emotional, and then he looked around, he said, "This is weird," and was holding his bigger brother, and then I was like laughing, and I was like, this is a very tender moment. And then going back to Kevin and seeing him sit there like holding his arm or his hand or something, it really like brought that back out of me.
Yeah, no, I cannot emphasize enough how much I echo you there and everything that you're saying there. It's like that ending sequence there absolutely obliterated me. But I do want to emphasize as well Durkin's direction, because it starts with that opening scene of the film. We talked about it in context of Fritz and what it means for that character. But after his match there in the ring, they go to the car and we see his two sons. One of them is little Kevin, but also his older brother, the oldest of all the brothers, and Jack Atkinson Jr. is his name. And what I love about Durkin's direction here, we hear Fritz talking. I believe there's a few reverse shots between Doris and Fritz in the car. But eventually it gets to a moment where there's this elongated close up on Jack as they're driving down the road. Just this close up on him as the conversation goes. And that's how the scene ends, with this moment of reflection on Jack. And then he simply disappears from the movie, right? Because there's a cut, and then we immediately get to the early 80s with the Von Erichs, at least with Kevin already in the ring and his brother soon to follow. Mm-hmm. And so they're much older. And so he's gone. Jack is gone. The film doesn't really tell us what happened to him, but I think through the course of the events of this film, the curse, there might have been a moment. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it out loud here, I think there is a moment where, because doesn't Kevin in that first date scene with Pam, I think he mentions that his older brother died, right?
Yeah. She, it was at the bar, or the sports bar where he's getting the wings. He says, he says something to where he's like, I actually had an older brother, because I think she asked if he's the oldest.
That's
and he
right,
said, I'm the oldest of the ones left. I actually had an older brother who died when I was 5.
Yes. And it's this tender moment where Pam compassionately reacts toward Kevin. And it's one of those first early moments in the film where we start to see that vulnerability underneath the physical facade of Kevin, as we talked about earlier, which is a great moment. So we come to an understanding there. But again, there's so much that happens, you almost forget about Jack until you get to this final scene.
Not to cut you off, but until you brought it up just now, I forgot that he was in that shot in the beginning. And it's like, it's really starting to get to me again.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about it. And
it's a great detail.
Yeah.
Absolutely love that. And as you noted, it's this beautiful shot. It begins with Carrie there on the water in the boat heading toward the dock. And you see David and Mike standing there waiting for him. And that alone, like, he gets off the boat, he steps onto the dock, and you see the three of them embrace. That alone is emotionally satisfying there. And maybe it's because of how Durkin stages the scene, the fact that we hadn't thought about Jack, so much has already happened that it leaves your mind, which is a great sleight of hand. I love that Durkin does this because he stages it where, we see the three brothers embrace there on the dock, and then David and Mike separate. And you noted there, Carrie says something to the effect of, is our older brother here? Mm-hmm. And, they kind of split apart, and you see little Jack there. And I did not anticipate that moment at all. Mm-hmm. And it gobsmacked me, absolutely destroyed me when he picked him up and started to hug him. It was emotionally enthralling. Absolutely one of my favorite moments of the year, hands down.
I think it's so much more important because, and I think this goes back to the idea that this is what Kevin wants for his brothers. I think it's so much more important going back to that beginning, knowing that, the three younger brothers in the movie never got to meet Jack, seemingly, because all we can assume is that, he was alive at the beginning and then he died shortly after, but he's still the same age that he was at the beginning. So there's this understanding that they never got to meet him. So it's almost like this first time that all three of the younger brothers that were so close to Kevin got to meet their older brother. And so seeing it from Kevin, thinking that this is, from Kevin's point of view, from his mindset, it's like, this is the first time that his brothers, the most important people in his life, have all been able to embrace, fully. And I just think it's such a perfect scene in a movie that was already full of just perfect moments. And I think any little gripes and, upsetness that I had with it was thrown out the window and fully realized in that scene.
It's so good. Absolutely wonderful. And that, leads to the final scene of the film. So the dock scene is great. And then we get to the final scene of the film where my immediate reaction, I want to say I threw this out on Twitter as well. I would nominate Zac Efron for this last sequence alone. Forget the rest of the movie where he's excellent. I would nominate him just for this last moment. And in some ways, it feels like I'm sabotaging my own ethos because I am someone, Jacob, that prefers subtlety. Something like Perfect Days. I don't know if you've seen Perfect Days.
Not yet. I have it, but I haven't been able to
but
see
like
it yet.
That's a performance, that central performance there by Koji Yakusho is incredible because everything is so internalized. There's one moment of outward catharsis, but mostly it's this quiet, tender, subtle internal performance. And those are the types of performances that I love. However, this year, there's something about 2023 where that is started to push the boundaries a little bit more because there are moments of catharsis this year that I have just really responded to as some of my favorites of the year. A lot of people talk about Sandra Hüller and that fight sequence, that flashback with her husband, and that's not the moment of that film for me. That is maybe 10th on the list of the great moments of that film. It's good, but to me, I think about that moment in the car at the end of that film when she tells a joke as to offer some levity as a way to try to cope, but immediately those laughs turn immediately into tears, and she is overwhelmed by what had just happened. I think of that moment. Or another example, Zac Efron in the final scene of this moment where by the time we get to it, he is the last man standing. You could even argue that while his father is alive, what relationship is there to be had after what had just happened with Carrie? He is really feeling alone, completely separated from his family, aside from maybe his mother. But he's the last brother, not just the 3 that we see in this film that are killed off. There's, of course, Chris, that's not even in this film, who's also dead by this point as well. And his older brother, Jack, as we talked about earlier, like all of his brothers, but there's 5 of them. All of them have died. He's the last one left.
Well, no, there's 6.
Okay.
In the movie, I guess there's 5, but if we're bringing up Chris, there's 6 total.
6 total, and 5 of them are gone. He's the last one left, and he's sitting there in the grass watching his 2 sons innocently play there in the yard, and we get a close-up of him just lingering there watching his sons and knowing, like, all of this context, all of this tragedy, all of this grief just kind of compiling as he watches his sons play there, about the bonding of brotherhood, the strengths of brotherhood, the love of brotherhood. There's something that is so evocative. It's almost hard to articulate what it means to a person. And we had seen this constantly throughout the film with Kevin. Despite everything that had happened, even the envy that he had experienced, he was shaped by that bond, by that love of his brothers. He always championed them. He always supported them, even though they got the opportunities he didn't. And you see that so gracefully in the character. I know we tried to avoid it earlier when we were talking about the physicality of Zac Efron in this film. Yes, you get a couple of scenes of him in the ring early on, but the moment of physicality in this film that is the strongest is when he has to physically pick up Carrie, who had just shot himself, and carry him into the house and put him on the table. Like, that to me is one of the most potent moments of this film. And so throughout this whole film, we had seen what brotherhood meant to him on this deep, profound, almost spiritual level. And then to watch his 2 boys play there in the grass and have something that was taken from him, he loses it, just completely unravels. It's a moment where the film completely earns that moment. And Zac Efron, God bless him, is so goddamn great. The poignancy of that film is striking. It's amazing. And, you got to love his two sons come up to him like, what's wrong, Dad? And I'm going to lose it now that I'm talking about it. It's great. Like his reaction there is phenomenal. Great moment.
My my favorite, that scene is full of great moments and full of great lines. Um, I think, a lot of people gravitate towards the "I used to be a brother," and then his son saying, "We'll be your brother." Like I think that a lot of people gravitate towards that. I think the kind of encapsulation of the whole movie is the line right before where he comes up, and he's sitting there and he just has a couple tears flowing. He hasn't
Yeah.
fully just gone, ballistic or anything like that. And he's just sitting there and he's just looking into the sun. He sees his sons, they come up and he says, a man's not supposed to cry. And his sons go, "What are you talking about? We cry all the time." And I
Oh,
think it's just
yes. Yes. Great point. Yep.
I think it's that is kind of because you see throughout the whole film, especially in the physicality of the performance, you see throughout the whole film that whenever something bad is happening, he goes to the ring and he's working out, he is
Mhm.
jumping off, whatever, he's going to the ring and
Oh yeah, that
he's
moment of him going
constantly
back and forth there at the end, and the
it's yeah,
camera's in stationary there on the rope. Oh, so good.
it's one of those things. He always goes back to wrestling and he goes back to the ring, and this is the moment where he sits down and he really thinks about his life and his family and his brothers and everything, and he just he lets out a couple tears, and you can see a little bit in his face just how embarrassed he feels in that moment because it's so ingrained in him that he's not supposed to cry, and then when his brothers kind of console him and show him that it's okay. He really becomes the most vulnerable of the whole movie. And then you
Yeah,
get, of course, the line of "I used to be a brother," and it just, yeah,
it's good.
it's a lot.
It's
It
good.
is a lot, and it's such. I mean, I'm with you 100%. I think the physicality and the emotion of Zac Efron's performance throughout the whole movie is already up there with some of the best of the year. But I think what really tips it over is that final scene
Yeah,
where it is pure emotion and pure, um, just him, and it's fantastic.
no, so good. I completely agree. Well, as we wind down this conversation, do you have any final thoughts before we get out of
No,
here?
I just it's this is easily one of my favorite films of the year. I think it's one of the best. Uh I wish the A24 had more faith in it because I think it could have been a huge awards player.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
so
I think they missed an opportunity here. I know they have
I
other films that they want to emphasize, but I think they had something.
yeah, I think if they would have held this off until next summer or had done a festival run, I think it has a really great shot. Um
Yeah.
But I'm hoping for Zac Efron to get a couple nominations coming up. I think it's
Mhm.
it's more than it's more than worthy, and clearly with everything that's been going on Twitter, there's such a passion behind it as well, just from audience members. I mean,
Mhm.
it got the highest ranked cinema score of any A24 movie,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
is to me that is just it's so striking. Um, I think it really it really is such a fantastic film. Um, it's one of again, like I said, it's one of my favorites of the year. Some of the best performances of the year, some of the best direction, writing, cinematography, editing, score, sound work,
Yeah.
stunt work, like everything, just top to bottom. It's so masterful in so many ways, and it's to me, it's also the biggest surprise of the year. Coming into the year, I didn't know the story.
Sure. Yeah.
I'd only known it was tragic, and with stories this tragic, they can be taken in such poor ways.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that every correct decision was made in the making of this film.
Mm.
And yeah, I think it's utterly breathtaking filmmaking, acting, um, all of it.
Yeah.
I think even like I said, even the gripes I had, I think with the writing. There was a point where I was like, okay, it's going too much into the brother aspect, but then you kind of see the end of it and you realize why it goes so much into the brother aspect is because
Yeah,
that's all he had and that's all he's lost.
that's
And
what it's about. Yeah.
just an absolutely fantastic film.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I really like this film a lot as well. I do have a few quibbles with it. Mostly it comes down to pacing, I think is a little uneven at times when there's so much story to tell and Sean Durkin wants to delve into the nuances of the emotions of these characters as much as he can while having to tell such a large story that has a lot of moving components to it. So I do think the pacing at times is a little uneven. I think the editing at times can perhaps become a victim of the same thing. But mostly what I love about the film and Sean Durkin, I think he is aware of those flaws. I don't think he necessarily tries to hide those blemishes, but I do think he makes up for that with other flourishes in his direction, such as the overlapping shot that you had referenced earlier that I mentioned in my opening thoughts that is really fantastic, or the way we talked about the docking sequence, how that is staged. And like there are tricks that he throws out here that I think make the film so cinematically engaging. So those blemishes, I think, are hardly felt, hardly seen, and don't really impact this film at all in a large sense. And maybe my other criticism, and maybe this simply boils down to the deep reverence that Sean Durkin shows this family. I think there's an argument to be made that at times he sanitizes the story, where he, of course, avoids certain controversies, not just with Fritz, but also with David and his death as well, leaving out Chris altogether. All of the death takes place off screen, and perhaps there's an argument to be made that by showing some of that, delving into some of those controversies, you could have added a little bit more depth. But again, there's so much story here that something has to be cut. And I think the film I think that's the result you get given his vision for this film in that regard. So yes, a few things here and there, but my quibbles with this film are nothing more than that. They're little nitpicks that don't really impact the film in a large sense. It's still really great. One of the better films of the year for sure. The performances here are fantastic. I'll echo Zac Efron one more time. But this whole cast is excellent. It's all very good. Durkin's direction, fantastic. And the music, you talked about it earlier, not just the score, but the needle drops here are wonderful, well-timed, some of the best of the year. So, yeah,
The Tom
film.
Sawyer one got a couple claps from my audience.
Yeah. I mean, for all of the death and the turmoil in this film, there is an energy throughout a lot of it that it's actually quite infectious. That's rambunctious at times, especially early on when the brothers are thriving in the ring and you see the three of them going at, their, I guess the people that they're fighting in the ring, and you see the camaraderie there. Like all of the action in the ring, I think is orchestrated extremely well, and it complements the bonding of these brothers that we see out of the ring. Like that comes through into the ring impeccably. Like those two things are intimately tethered together, and it makes for some incredible storytelling. And I also just overall love the Texas aesthetic in Durkin's direction here too. I know others have pointed that out. It's very Texan as a movie, which is quite great. So yeah, I'm a big fan. I do recommend this as well. Please check it out if you haven't already. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please leave a comment on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, rate and review us there. Really helps out the show. And of course, you can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. Jacob, thanks so much for being here, man. This was a pleasure.
No, I love being here. I'm glad I got asked. I'm glad I got to talk about this movie, and I love coming on these podcasts and getting to formulate my thoughts even more. So
yeah, love it.
So yeah, I'm glad you asked me on, and I can't wait to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait to get you back. Where can the good people find you on social media?
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd at tberry57. Follow me on at least Letterboxd.
Yeah, be sure to give him a follow. If you just do a random search for anything regarding the Iron Claw on Twitter, you're going to find one of his tweets. Guaranteed.
Probably at this point, yeah.
But yeah, really do appreciate you being here. With that, that'll do it for this episode. Jacob, do you have any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here for this one?
It was a good year for movies. I can't wait for 2024 and the burst of blockbusters that's coming out this year.
Yep. We'll get into our most anticipated films of the year here soon. We have the Infraction Film Awards coming up next week, so be prepared for that. We'll dive into not just
I was
our
very
awards,
Iron Claw
but
heavy in those, I have to say.
yeah. Looking forward to unveiling all of that coming very soon. In the meantime, thanks, Jacob, once again for being here. Thanks for listening, watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.